Good morning, everyone. It's great to see such a fantastic crowd here for our occasional seminar. My name is Rick Brown. I'm Deputy Director with the AIC. Before I go on, let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and welcome you all here for this event. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Peter German, KC, who is President of the International Centre for Criminal Law Reform, also known as ICLR, and Chair of the Advisory Committee of the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. Among his many achievements, he's a lawyer and member of the Ontario and British Columbia bars, and was previously a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, serving as its Director General for Financial Crime and as Deputy Commissioner for Western and Northern Canada. He's also previously served as Regional Deputy Commissioner for Correctional Service Canada. Now, the AIC has a special relationship with ICLR, as we're both part of the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program network that supports UNODC in its mission. So I'm really pleased that we could take advantage of Peter being in Australia, where he's currently a visiting professor with the Faculty of Law at Bond University. Flies back Tuesday, I think, so we've just caught you before you head off back to Canada, Peter. So Peter will be presenting on transnational organised crime, a global threat. So can we please welcome Peter to the stage?
Well, thank you so much, Rick. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here, and what a great crowd. Thanks for taking time out of your day, and it tells me that people are actually working in Australia. You're not all at home. It's wonderful. It's great. I noticed in my time at Bond University, it's just a wonderful university, and see, the professors are actually at the law school, which is really kind of neat, and to see people again and be able to converse back and forth. So just a pleasure to be here. I have to thank Rick. This is just a wonderful occasion to be here with you. Rick and I go back quite a long way with our partner agencies, and anything I could do to assist the Australian Institute of Criminology, I'm happy to do that. We meet from time to time in different parts of the world, it seems, and so it's really nice to be on his home turf. This is not my first time to Canberra. I've been here a couple of times. So just thank you for that introduction, and just to sort of give you a little bit more so you understand, like, where's this person's headspace from? I've got this sort of eclectic background in that I was in policing for 31 years, but was also a lawyer before that and continued to do that now, plus consulting and running this institute. And over time, most of my work ended up in the financial crime field. And then, as we know, financial crime, organized crime, it all sort of goes together. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then I sort of moved into a little bit of the academia and so forth. But everything sort of coalesces around the topics that I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm happy to take questions at any point. If I start running on in my Canadian accent, by the way, Canadians have the perfect American accent. I've been in Uber a lot the last couple of months, and the drivers will always say, well, what state are you from? And then I say, well, we're sort of that state above the 49th parallel, and, oh, sorry, Canadian, and that sort of thing. But it's all very nice. We have a lot in common with Australia, although we're a distance apart. When you think about it in terms of countries with strong Indigenous roots, strong Commonwealth roots, large countries, developed countries, if we can still use that term. And we have a lot of back and forth. If you go to Whistler, which is very close to where I live in Vancouver, it's Australians that run Whistler these days. It's all the young people. And then you come down here and Canadians are here for their summer employment. So it's really neat to see the back and forth. My daughter actually is a medical doctor in Gold Coast, which is my incentive, extra incentive to come down here. So a lot of ties between our countries. So I hope what I talk to you about today has some relevance, and you won't say, oh, well, like, why are we talking about Canada? I will try to, give a few insights into my thoughts on how all of this relates to Australia, because you've had very similar issues to what we have. And I think in the future, you will continue to have similar issues to what we have. I've also done some work in the Mekong countries and visited a number of other areas around here, Macau and Hong Kong, China, and so forth. So I have a bit of an understanding of what you're dealing with, but I know that there are some real experts in this room, so I don't mean to suggest that I have more knowledge than some of the people in this room. So I'm just going to, get us all on sort of a level playing field here to begin with and talk about organized crime and just a few characteristics of it. I like to pick on people of my generation, and I say, you were in a criminology course 30 or 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, whatever it is, and you learned in your criminology program about this organized crime group and that organized crime group. It's no longer like that internationally. And really, you just have to think about the world that we live in. It's all about this global world, this small world, really, now. The world's become so much smaller. I mean, I was, this morning I'm talking to people in Ottawa and in Vancouver, and it's just like you're next door, and you say, oh, by the way, I'm in Canberra, and they go, huh, but that's our world. And we FaceTime around the world and that sort of thing. Organized crime's the same. They're doing the same things that everybody else is doing. They're leveraging this global world of ours. So we really increasingly talk about TOC rather than OC. So it's transnational organized crime, because there's a transnational aspect to most of organized crime. Loose alliances. So what used to be very structured has become much more loosey-goosey, because, as we'll talk, it's all about making money, and it's about forming alliances as you go. Organized crime is no longer commodity specific. You used to have those organized. The mafia, for example, only did certain things. They wouldn't go near drugs for the longest time. And then the Cosa Nostra in the US said, well, actually, drugs is quite attractive. And next thing you know, the mob's very involved in that. But that's no longer the case. Organized crime is going to go where the money is. And whether it's drugs, human trafficking, environmental, trafficking of one sort or another, animal parts, you name it, they're going to be there, firearms, and so forth. We also see, particularly in the Asian context, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, Vancouver, we look at ourselves as an Asian city, quite proudly, because we're on the west coast of Canada, and all our commerce is back and forth with Asia. And we're right next to the U.S., so the U.S. is our big brother, or sister that's always there with us, but most of our commerce is going east-west. But now you're finding, and particularly in that Asian organized crime world, that legal enterprises and illegal enterprises mix together. And a quick example of that would be container traffic. Container traffic, let's say 95, 96% of it is totally legitimate, but you'll have that 4 or 5%, maybe it's 1%, I don't know, that will tailgate, as we call it. So dirty cargo that's thrown in with legitimate cargo, and making it so difficult to find that when thousands of containers come off a one ship and you've got minimal resources. Bifurcated structure, we first saw with the Colombian cartels that the money and the drugs, if we use a drug trafficking ring, often are separate. And that's for security reasons. It's to make sure safety purposes, any number of different reasons. The Colombian cartel would have their money operation and their drug operation. The two would be separate. And oftentimes the people running the money didn't know the people running the drugs. And that's more and more common these days. We see that with the Mexican cartels and so forth. We also see that organized crime moves from sector to sector, again, because it isn't commodity specific. It'll move. Now, in Canada, we've legalized marijuana a couple of years ago. It really hasn't created much change. What I like to say now is that the federal government and organized crime are competing for market share. And it seems increasingly that's exactly what's happening. So eventually, I think the federal government will win, just like government won with prohibition after a number of years back in 100 years ago. But at this point, they haven't, because organized crime is just going to provide like a stronger variety, better service, a lower price, you name it. And not so long ago, a number of our public servants were on strike. And so, organized crime doesn't go on strike. So they just sort of fill the vacuum. And to the point that a number of senior CEOs and so forth of our large marijuana companies were in our national capital, our Canberra, Ottawa, asking for government handouts because things are tough in the industry. Well, and they're complaining that government has too much regulation, licensing, and all of that that's cutting down on their ability to compete with organized crime. So that's what you get into. Organized crime just moves on to something else. They'll either provide that better quality or they'll go on to coke or heroin or whatever it is. We'll talk a little bit more about money service businesses, luxury goods, cryptocurrency. It's all sorts of things that organized crime is becoming, is very engaged in. So what does organized crime look like from a Canadian perspective? We have our bikers, and there's the Colombian cartel and El Chapo, who was running money through Vancouver. You think Mexican cartel running money through Vancouver? This does not making much sense. But we also in Vancouver had more chapters of the Hells Angels and the Nomads in our metropolitan area than anywhere else. And you say, okay, that doesn't make sense either. So we'll get to that in a minute. Why does organized crime love Canada? Well, let's see. So just a little bit of a geography lesson. I know most of you would know this and many of you have visited. So I'm talking about Vancouver. So we're right there. And that's why I talk about us being an Asian city. But our largest city is Toronto here, and then Montreal, and we have Halifax here. What's common about our population is that most of our population lives on the 49th parallel. I live right beside the U.S. border, and most people gravitate that way because, of course, it's a little bit warmer. It's not Canberra at the best of times. Maybe in July, August, we have your weather, but that's about it. So, what is interesting about that, of course, is that the U.S. is the largest drug-consuming nation in the world, illegal drug-consuming nation in the world. So for all the good that we have and we have a great relationship, of course, with the United States, there's also that downside, and we're right there, and we're north. And here are some of the things that we've got going for us. And it's not too different from Australia, right? A meeting point for Asia and North America, beautiful seaports, airports, modern banking facilities, high tech, access to the U.S. We have visa-free access to Mexico, which allows Mexican folks to come up on visitor visas, oftentimes, overstaying on it and working. We have large ethnic diasporas, which we're very proud of, have been around for a long time, Asian community and South Asian community. But organized crime, as you know, tends to start in ethnic communities. And I use the Caucasian ethnic community as an example. The Hells Angels are an organization that is predominantly white. And so, and particularly when there are language issues, organized crime will stay in its own community and plague its own people, so to speak, because of language and culture and so forth. And it's once they become familiar with the bigger country and the language, that's when they start to spread their wings. And we've had established organized crime networks for a long time. We have very mild criminal sanctions. We don't throw the key away, other than for murder, which is life imprisonment. But we have a strong parole system. Everybody gets out if they behave and if they want to. And our parole system is actually very good. But the bottom line is we don't throw the key away. The sanctions in the United States are much more severe, and the federal system in the United States doesn't even have parole. You get a little bit of a reduction. So people don't want to get caught in the U.S. if they're trafficking between our two countries. And we have a lot of difficulty investigating and prosecuting, and that's a whole other lecture why we've had significant issues in this area, particularly financial crime. So that's my vehicle. That is a Ford Fusion hybrid. It's got about 250,000 miles on it. The reason it's here is to show that we actually get snow in Vancouver, which is the warmest part of Canada, but also to make you aware of the fact that Wikipedia has a special entry for Canada called snow washing. The term is an amalgam of the word snow, meaning purity. Canadians, they can't do anything wrong. They're very pure, as well as the cold Canadian climate, and washing, referring to money laundering. So we've actually got our own entry, and that term was coined by a Toronto reporter, and so it's now in Wikipedia. So we've got a bit of a reputation now for laundering money, which is not a good thing. Why be concerned? Well, people in my province, so think about Canadian provinces like your states. In British Columbia, go back about 6 years, money laundering would have meant nothing to anybody, really. But now, pretty everybody knows about money laundering as a result of a lot of attention placed on it, and a connection that's been drawn to the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is a pretty nasty place. It used to be you could walk down the downtown east side and no one would bother you, but now full of tents, full of homeless, lots of knives and weapons for protection and everything else. And opioids. We lost a lot more people as a result of drug deaths than we did through COVID, and we had a lot of COVID too. But the deaths more with opioids and fentanyl and so forth. Not just in the downtown east side, but this is an example of it. And it's all about organized crime. They're making the money on all of this. Now, I know for some people here who are very familiar with money laundering, this is old stuff. But just to, again, make sure that we're all on the same track, again, organized crime is all about making money. And some years ago, essentially the Americans said, well, look, why don't we follow the money to go backwards and find organized crime? And so that's what law enforcement increasingly tries to do. And we refer to money as not only been the raison d'etre, the reason why organized crime exists, but also it can be its Achilles heel. It can be that fragility in the organized crime network that can be pursued by law enforcement. Most people have probably seen this picture of a stash house. I've heard, I don't know if this was in Mexico or in Los Angeles, but I've heard different versions. But it gives you an example of, I used to do presentations and I'd carry a kilo of money with me. Now, it was all cut up US dollars. You can actually get them at the Federal Reserve in the US, but it's a kilo of money. And the point being that a kilo of heroin, for example, will produce many kilos of $20 bills. And $20 bills being sort of the standard a bill that we find in the US and Canada, and I suspect in Australia for drug traffickers. And so it's actually harder to move the money than it is the drugs. So you could hide a kilo of heroin a lot easier than you could the number of kilos of money that result from its sale. And most dirty money just goes back to buying more product. Of course, organized crime is trying to take its own profit out of it. How do you launder money? Well, there are no rule books. You just basically stay one step ahead of the authorities, use nominees, structure your transactions. If you can corrupt people, that's wonderful in the financial community and government, customs, you name it. And, cover stories, legitimate businesses. There are a couple of there are 3 well-known stages of money laundering. Again, most people are familiar with this. It's like your washing machine: wash, spin, dry, place, layer, integrate. So get the money, the dirty money, somehow back into the financial system. And that's done in many different ways, using smurfs, numerous people to bring money into a bank, using cash-based businesses. We're going to talk about casinos, smuggling it out of the country, bulk smuggling. Now cryptocurrencies become, the thing of the day, so to speak, and money service businesses, underground bankers. And then you go into the layering phase where if this is a complex organization, you move the money around internationally as best you can. And there's no limit to how much you can layer transactions. In Canada, it wouldn't be surprising for money to move into the Caribbean and find its way back to Canada in the final stage. So any number of different ways to do that. Probably good to note at this point that certain professions are really at risk when it comes to money laundering. And the one that I'm a lawyer, very proud to be a lawyer, and lawyers jealously guard solicitor-client privilege, the relationship with a client. And I know there's some people here from the Attorney General's ministry, but lawyers are also the gatekeepers for virtually all financial transactions, right? If you're going to purchase property, businesses, and so forth, it's probably going to go through a lawyer. So they play a very pivotal role. And as gatekeepers, they can also be facilitators, willingly or unwillingly, of illegal transactions. And in most countries, still, despite the Financial Action Task Force's recommendations, lawyers don't report suspicious transactions and do limited due diligence or know your client. And in Canada, it's been a big issue for quite some time. I know in Australia and New Zealand, there's been a move to finding a way to have lawyers report, whether it's to a third-party body or not. But the big issue tends to be lawyer trust accounts. And I'll talk about Canada. In Canada, no one sees what's in a lawyer's trust account other than the bank, the lawyer, and the law society, which can monitor trust accounts. And they're doing a pretty good job of that, but there isn't any third-party oversight. So I'm going to talk a little about casinos. Now, I know Australia's had some casino issues too, and you have big casinos, and we have big casinos. Ours are organized a little bit differently, so I'm not suggesting that our problems are exactly like yours, but there are some similarities. So casinos, of course, are cash-based businesses in most places, and that's why they're very attractive to organized crime. The other thing I would suggest, other reason that they're attractive, is because people involved in criminal enterprise they're risk takers. And what do you do when you go to a casino? It's about taking risks, right? And we used to think in policing that casinos were a poor way to sort of launder money. But increasingly, we came to the realization, no, it's actually the opposite, because it doesn't matter how you launder money, you pay somebody. And so you're going to lose a certain percentage to the people that help you. Well, that's what you're going to do in a casino as well. The algorithms are against you, but you can still run a lot of money through, and you can predict almost to the exact percentile what you will lose, and so what is the cost of that exchange. This is what we were seeing in Vancouver, and this went on for years. So just a little bit about our casino industry. What's interesting about it is it's actually run by government. We have a Crown Corporation that runs our casinos, and then they contract with service providers, and the service providers are your typical casino companies from, let's say, Vegas and so forth. The large casino companies don't function independently as corporate entities in Canada. They are contractors to the provincial government. And the provincial government can basically set all the rules in terms of casinos, and they make a lot of money every year, year over year, from the casinos, to the point that casino and lottery revenue was the largest non-tax source of revenue in the province. So well over $1 billion a year. And so it was easy for government to accept whatever people were saying. A lot of people were saying, well, there's no money laundering going on. There's no issues. If there is a problem, it's in a small area and it can be dealt with. And so we didn't see overt corruption. We just saw, government sort of ignorant of what was taking place, or sort of not paying too much attention. And we had regulators. We had a provincial regulator and federal regulator, or FIU, like your OSTRAC. Ours is called FinTrack. And in fact, it was patterned in many ways after OSTRAC. But our provincial regulator really doubled as a policy center for government. And when you have a regulator that is also a policy center for government, they tend to spend a lot of time being a policy center for government and writing briefing notes and all that sort of stuff. And I'm sure some people here can appreciate that, and not as much time regulating as one might hope. Law enforcement, we also had quite a jumbled system going on. We have 3 levels of law enforcement. You have, of course, your federal police, but you've also got your state police. We have municipal police, we have provincial police, and we have federal police. And we also have our national police force, the RCMP, works on contract, sort of like the sheriffs do in the United States, looking after smaller communities and actually some very large communities. So you have a lot of law enforcement. Everyone in that world sort of knows who does what. But when you've got casinos in, let's say, in our lower mainland, 5 around the Vancouver area, about 5 different jurisdictions, 5 different municipal police forces or contract RCMP units. We've got a provincial RCMP with casino units, one that was disbanded, another one that was started up 6 years later. And our federal RCMP had a proceeds of crime unit that was abolished in 2013 in favor of a new model, sort of patterned on the British, with an organized crime emphasis rather than commodity specific. And there might be a lot to be said for changing the model, but we found that when, at least in my opinion, when we moved away from the commodity-specific investigative units, you lost a lot of the expertise that used to be there and that was resident in our proceeds of crime units. So the bottom line in all of this is there really was no police actively involved in the casinos. They were responding to calls for service, and that was about it. Now, it all falls to Professor John Langdale of Macquarie University in Australia. While I'm doing those reports, those dirty money reports, and I'm looking at open source research and all of that, I come upon a PowerPoint, and it's a PowerPoint from John Langdale, who I didn't know at the time, and he was presenting to the New South Wales Police, and it was on illicit financial flows and so forth. And I look at his PowerPoint posted on the internet, public document, and the last slide talks about the Vancouver model. Vancouver model? What's that? What Vancouver are we talking about, right? Well, it was our Vancouver, and John Langdale, being an Asian organized crime expert, had been watching what was taking place in Canada. And of course, because he's interested in parallels with Australia, and he coined what was taking place, and I'll describe it in a minute, as the Vancouver model. And that has stuck ever since, because I sort of, brought that to the attention of our Attorney General, and he went, what? And that's the gentleman that you saw on the screen. He's now the Premier of the province. So anyway, what was really happening is at that time, going back about 6 years, a lot of people in China, legitimate business people, were trying to move money out of China and were stuck with the capital outflow restrictions, 50,000 US equivalent per year. And so how do you get money out of China and buy property overseas? And just like Australia, Canada was one of the desirable destinations. So underground bankers were being used. Money was dropped or was deposited with an underground banker in China. That banker would call a confederate in Canada who was told you can give a certain individual $100,000, let's say, when they arrive, and there would be a surreptitious meet at a restaurant or outside a casino, and the money, Canadian money, would be given to this person. And then later on, there's, of course, as you know, with underground banking, there's a settling of accounts between both parties, the party in China and the party in Canada, after everyone takes their take. And that way the individual gets the money out of China. But where does the money in Canada come from? Well, the money in Canada it's the proceeds of drug trafficking in Canada. It's domestic drug trafficking. It's Mexican cartel money. It's money that has to be laundered. And so the person from China, unbeknownst to them, is being given dirty Canadian. So it works for everybody's purposes. The capital money leaves, capital outflow from China. Dirty money is laundered in Canada, and oftentimes a lot of big high rollers, whale gamblers as they call them, from China took the money and gambled in our casinos. So, and it gets a little bit more complicated in that if this was an organized crime ring, the underground bankers actually, it's really a tripartite system where the money deposited in China could be used to purchase drugs in Latin America. Those drugs could be then moved into the United States and Canada. So it gets a lot more complicated. But for our purposes, this is just one flow chart, an I2 flow chart. It's public document. It's in the reports, and it's from our RCMP looking at the flow of money between underground bankers and involving and with a drug component involved in it. So we're not obviously going to look at it. I'll just point out that a lot of alarm bells went off, as you note from that video clip, and alarm bells that people probably should have paid attention to but didn't over the years. And journalists were very important in this. Journalists were raising issues. And it's not as if the regulator and the lottery corporation didn't do some things. They were trying to tighten up the system. They were looking at alternatives to cash and so forth. But there was a lot of, as I described, that system breakdown. There was a lot of arguing between the regulator and the Crown Corporation running the casinos. And in my opinion, they didn't get very far until this whole thing blew up. I made a number of different recommendations. I'll just touch on two of them, well, three maybe. A lot of people said, well, you should put limits on how much money people can gamble. Internationally, that's just not the way it works in casinos. There are a lot of very wealthy people who want to gamble and want to gamble a lot of money. And if casinos didn't have those people, they would, in many cases, collapse. The issue is not how much money a person gambles, it's where the money came from, its source of funds. And there was really no source of funds declaration at the time. It was a sort of, name, occupation, anything over $10,000. It was a real pro forma thing. And so tightening that up. And then with regard to oversight, the regulator's oversight, I asked the regulator and I also asked the compliance people, what shifts do you work? Well, 9 to 5, 8 to 4. And I'm thinking, when do people gamble at casinos? Well, around Vancouver, they gamble all day long too, but most of them are there at nighttime, right? So the regulator's not there. So, 24/7 coverage, it just makes sense. And we talked about changing the paradigm, moving from a rules-based model to a risk-based model and putting more responsibility on the casino service providers. If you don't put responsibility on people's shoulders, they're going to do as much as necessary to sort of get over whatever hurdle they're dealing with, whether it is filling out forms or whatever. And, recommended that the regulator be really independent, dedicated police, legislative changes, and better definition of roles. Anyway, then we looked at crime vehicles. Well, people sort of poo-pooed the idea that you could have money laundering with cars and autos. Interestingly, in Canada, auto dealers do not have to report large cash transactions to FinTrack. I don't know if they do to Austrac, if vehicle dealers have to. Maybe someone here knows, but also boat dealers, auction houses do not have to report. So you've got some gaps. And the reason 20 years, 30 years ago was, well, cars don't cost that much and used cars don't cost that much. But recently, or a few years ago, Vancouver was per capita the luxury car capital of North America. Lambos and Ferraris and all of this sort of stuff. And you had to wonder, where's the money coming from? It was coming from different sources, many of it legitimate, but we also, by talking to dealers, it was obvious that organized crime was buying with cash $250,000, $300,000 for a car. And they would keep the cars for however long they wanted, a few months, and then they would give them to a reseller. Cost of doing business, drive a Lambo for a while, and then you sell the car and you purchase something else. So we were seeing that going on. And real estate was a big issue, just like in Australia, how housing prices went like that, and of course, COVID is the most recent example of why it went. But we had one of those increases in the markets a few years ago in the greater Vancouver area, and there was a lot of concern about where's the money coming from. So we looked at that. That's Vancouver a few years ago, and it just sort of took off the housing market. And obviously you've got, most of it is legal money, but you do have dirty money. You've got the capital flight money coming in. And we also had quite an underground economy in renovating houses, and houses, very nice houses that were being renovated. And the question was, how much do these renovations actually cost? And, is there room in there for money to be laundered? A lot of red flags. We looked at red flags, which are all internationally accepted red flags of money laundering. Individually, they would not be considered, wrong, like private lending, nothing wrong with that, high interest rates or low interest rates. But when you start putting a few of these red flags together, you say, okay, there's something going on. And then we would drill down and look at the actual house purchases and sales and try to figure out why were these transactions taking place. People on buying sprees, undervalued properties, all sorts of different things. And we also looked at our land title office system works very well, the Torrens system, which I think originated in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, the Torrens, but in any event, works very well. But it relies on people providing information. So you buy a house, you tell the land title office or your lawyer or notary, this is my occupation. So we had 33,000 rental properties, most of them high-end properties, in which the owner was a student, a homemaker, or unemployed, according to their occupation. So you've got million-plus properties, and you're saying, okay, there's nothing wrong with a homemaker purchasing a property in their name, or a student, or an unemployed person. But, and then we had even some people describe themselves as beach bum, no, not beach. I've been in Australia too long. It was ski bum, and that sort of thing as their occupation. So you have to wonder, where did this money really come from? 71,000 owners with using a post office box, and many residents using an offshore address and back and forth. So it was all over the place. Anyway, the whack-a-mole effect is alive and well. You deal with the casinos, and then where does the money go? And it's always trying to stay ahead of organized crime, as those of you involved in this know, because they've already moved out. Once the heat's on, they're gone. They're somewhere else. So where do they go? And we've seen that sort of movement. That if you're at all interested in the reports, which do provide a lot of background on these different topics, they're freely available. You just Google my name and dirty money, and you'll find them. Our center, they're on in our publications, but like I say, they're free to download or whatever. We had a public inquiry, just like you've had public inquiries that came out of all of this, and not just my reports, but that's an older version of me right there. That's my undercover version. I no longer look like that, fortunately. My wife liked the thing, and I said, so. But that's our public commissioner, Royal Commission. We had, about 13 lawyers sort of cross-examining, all representing different interest groups. But at the end of the day, there is a website for the Cullen Commission, Justice Cullen, Cullen, Cullen Commission. And for anyone interested in money laundering, it's actually a really good site, because you don't run into too many royal commissions or public inquiries that deal with a generic topic like money laundering or organized crime or something like that. It tends to be about a particular casino or a particular incident, a death or whatever it might be. But this actually looked at money, and they also brought in experts from overseas. And so it's received a lot of currency in various parts of the world. The report's over 1,000 pages, but there's an executive summary. It's about 30-some pages. But what's probably more important is all the research material that's there. So anyone researching this area, you'll find a wealth of material on their website. Now, I don't know how much longer their website will stay up, probably for a while, but there's a lot of material there, and a lot of them foreign to Canada. Okay, so implications for Australia. And again, I'm talking to you as an outsider looking in. Drugs is big here, and I blame us Canadians. We're the consumers of, right? So just like Australians are consumers of illicit drugs, you have casinos, much like we do, structured differently, but cash-based industries, very attractive to organized crime. Illicit wealth, we all deal with the same issues about dirty money coming into our countries. But you've got a lot of proximity to Asia that we don't. And I think that also leads to various, as I put it, geopolitical considerations. China has done a really good job of moving casinos out of China, right? So where have they gone? They've gone into the Mekong countries. I did some work for the UNODC in those countries. And a lot of the casinos and the big cities that have built around the casinos are found in areas of the Mekong that are away from the center of capitals, a lot of them in areas sort of controlled by militias. So you don't have even law enforcement, and some very precarious political situations in a number of these countries, and huge casinos, and a lot of junkets and so forth. As China cracks down on casinos in Macau and the junkets in Macau, more of it is going to move into the Mekong countries, and Australia is such an attractive target for anyone in that business, whether it's drugs, moving money, junkets, you name it. So a real resurgence in the Mekong countries, and big meth production in those countries, and of course globalization. Things can move around the world so easily. You're probably familiar with the company, the Sam Gore and so forth. Some people here with the federal police, may have even been involved in that investigation. We look at it from the outside in, really what you see in the media, but the company have achieved some notoriety as almost like the equivalent of the Mafia Commission, where triads and so forth got together and really decided to work collectively rather than at each other's throats, and really to produce and to move drugs. And you see, at least in the reports, a lot of flexibility in structure, consensus agreements, a business model that's actually quite successful, money back guarantee if you don't get your drugs, and a continuity of leadership. So Sam Gore, the head of the company, allegedly was arrested in the Netherlands not so long ago, a couple of years or so, year and a half ago, 2 years ago, on an Australian warrant. And where was he headed? He was headed to Toronto because he's a Canadian citizen. He had been kicked out of Taiwan. He's, as I understand it now, in Australian custody, and will be facing charges here. But it's sort of an example of how things are changing in that world. And if the news reports are correct in terms of how the company is structured and operates, it doesn't necessarily bode that well for where we are going with organized crime. And there he is with his Canada passport, although his hair is now white, as I understand it. So internationally, what are we doing about all of this? I know I've only got about 10 more minutes left, so I'll go through this rather quickly. The UN has been engaged, the Drug Convention of 1988, and then we have the Organized Crime, UNTOC, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime in 2000, and more recently in 2003, the UN Convention Against Corruption. So the UN has been looking at these issues, and there is consensus among the countries of the world that something has to be done about them. We've got lots of different international organizations engaged in this issue, whether it's the UN itself, UN Office on Drugs and Crime that we're associated with through our institutes, Financial Action Task Force, and so forth. But at the end of the day, the most recent push has been on corruption. And if we take everything we've talked about organized crime and look at what it does to nations and combine that with the specter of corruption, we really, as global citizens, have a lot to deal with. That's the face of corruption. Corruption in countries tends to impact the poor, women, children. It prevents access to basic health services, education, and so forth. And as they say, if leaders are corrupt, corruption will go all the way down. And so many countries are suffering from this. I just had the honor to help open a conference virtually in Bamako, Mali, of African leaders in the anti-corruption fight, and the room was full. I mean, in Africa, it's seen as virtually the number one issue, more so even than poverty, because corruption leads to so much. It's like a war crime in and of itself. And, we can go back to the involvement of the developed world in the developing countries, the global south, way back to Bhopal in the 70s, and the corruption that resulted from that disaster and making reparations. But here's an interesting one. I don't know if you've seen this book. Oliver Bulow is a wonderful English journalist, and he recently wrote the book Butler to the World about the involvement of the United Kingdom in kleptocrats and being a safe haven for kleptocrats from third world countries, use that term. And he talks about how, Britain is ideally suited to do all of these things that we talked about, laundering money and illicit financial flows. A great book to look at if you're at all interested. But the point I'm making here is that we all have responsibility to deal with corruption because it's a huge international issue. And how do you deal with it? Whistleblowers, critical. Journalists are critical. We need, of course, foreign bribery laws, and most of our countries have them, but not too many are enforcing them. And we just can't be safe havens for example, kleptocrats who escape with their money, their pension funds from countries. We can't allow our own companies to get, engage in bribery and so forth. We really need transparency in everything that we do. Transparency is the greatest antidote to corruption. We talk about beneficial ownership registries. Who owns what? Right? We don't know who owns property in our country. We don't know who owns companies in our country because there are so many different ways that you can mask ownership through lawyers and company formation agents and so forth. Transparency in procurement. How often are relief funds sent to different countries, and those funds are subject to corruption. And transparency in the courts. Governance, a lot of this is, standard fare. We're noticing in Canada, we recently had a trucker protest over our COVID regulations and everything else. And one of the ways the federal government actually dealt with it was to impose financial restrictions on the truck through our FinTrack and our national police. There were emergency regulations put in place. And essentially, banks were told, you can't deal with these people that are currently blocking our parliament precinct. And as soon as they realized that the money flow was cut off and companies realized, our truckers are potentially going to stem the flow of funds into our bank accounts, things changed dramatically. We've also seen that with, of course, the Russian oligarchs. What first thing the world community decided to do after Russia invaded Ukraine was go after the oligarchs, which is really using financial tools. How successful we will be is another thing. And that brings me to our own little institute. We put this together really to try to reverse the bad taste in everybody's mouth about the Vancouver model. So we created the Institute, Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, as a sort of our iClear gave birth to this second institute. And we've got a great advisory committee, including the female who broke the glass ceiling in Canada, our first and only female Prime Minister, Kim Campbell. A number of other people that are really committed to anti-corruption. And so we try to look at these different issues, journalists and whistleblowers and e-government, which is a great way to deal with corruption. And I think that's it. So thank you.